Welcome back. This is part 3 of our mini lecture on the Battle of Verdun. And on our notes for the Battle of Verdun, I'm down here on page 2. Towards the bottom of page 2, we've been dealing with French reinforcements. So just as a very quick reminder, we've had the initial onslaught by the Germans, and in particular massive artillery bombardment followed by very effective infantry attack. We had to bring in General Pétain in order to save Verdun, which he does, using the Sacred Way in order to bring up massive reinforcements to the Verdun area. Pétain becomes a hero, an absolute hero in French eyes. We haven't seen the last of him. He will be back later in the war. Instead, he's replaced by General Robert Nivelle. Now remember, Joffre is still in charge of the whole French army. Nivelle is just in charge now here at Verdun in order to save Verdun. But before I talk a little bit more about what he does, I just want to show you some of the pictures that really show you the impact of the Battle of Verdun. So this shot here is a German photograph, and it actually shows some of the French artillery that has been overrun and captured by the French. But I want you to look at the landscape around it. This was a heavily forested area before this artillery bombardment began. And here you can see what's left on the hillside after this very intense German bombardment. We've also got here, these are French soldiers in trenches, very makeshift trenches at this stage. And remember, once you get a shift and the Germans actually pushing forward, you do start to have to dig new trenches that are not as well protected and not necessarily as deep. We've also got gas masks here on our French soldiers because gas is used extensively in the Battle of Verdun. These shots here, you can tell from the helmets, are both shots of the Germans involved in the Battle of Verdun. And again, you can see the makeshift nature of these trenches. They are not well reinforced, and the artillery bombardment that has taken place, if there was a nicely built trench, it's gone. And again, take a look at the landscape around them. This was a heavily forested area. Here we've got a machine gun, and we've also got gas masks being used by the Germans as well. What we've got here is a hand grenade ready to be thrown. This picture again shows us the Germans in trenches, and even here we can see the shovels that are being used probably not that long ago in order to dig this makeshift trench as the German forces are moving forward. Interesting thing to note is this is the first major battle where we are seeing the coal scuttle helmets, the new steel helmets being used by the Germans. This is yet another shot just to really show you the devastation, the impact of the artillery bombardment on the environment in this area. And we can see here, of course, French soldiers. And these trenches are a little bit deeper, still mostly intact, but certainly not any of those model trenches that we've taken a look at in the past. These are fantastic shots showing us, this one is beautiful just because it's in colour, showing us the uniform of the French soldiers. And this one here is a reminder of the use of cavalry. These are actually reserves making their way up towards Verdun. And just a reminder that while we do have motorised transport, the majority of transport is still reliant on foot or on a horse in order to move around. So as we're talking about the French coming in, I want to explain to you a little bit about the way in which Nivelle uses the French troops at Verdun. It's really important to understand just how many of the French soldiers actually saw action at Verdun. And the strategy of Nivelle was to keep his troops fresh. And so what he actually did is rotated his troops. We can see here in the notes, he's rotating the French troops through Verdun on a regular basis. Sometimes they're up there for a number of weeks, and then they are replaced by new French troops that are brought from somewhere else on the line to take their turn at Verdun. This is fantastic because it means that the French troops are never completely exhausted. In contrast, we've got the Germans keeping the same troops on their line, only being replaced if they are wounded or ill in some way. So while our French troops are kept fresher, the downside of this tactic is that almost every soldier in the entire French army actually saw action at Verdun. And when we think about the circumstances, the experiences of what is happening at Verdun, this is actually going to have a massive moral impact on the French army. So while they are able to hold Verdun, just the sheer experience of this battle is going to cause problems for the French army as time goes on. You can see here I've predicted dire consequences for the French army in 1917. So just in the paragraph above, just stressing again, the Battle of Verdun is best known for the horrors caused by artillery bombardment and the effects that the shells had on man and landscape. Huge numbers of men went missing without identification due to the carnage on the battlefield. So in other words, many men blown up, blown apart, and not able to be identified, but known to be missing from the battle. And as we've already said, gas is also used extensively through this battle. So it has a massive moral impact on the French troops. The other thing to take note about with Nivelle, and I haven't actually written this in the notes, so make sure you add this to your notes as we're talking now. The way that Nivelle uses his troops is to really use large numbers, not only to defend, but to actually launch counter-offensives against the Germans. So what you can see here on this map, we've talked about how the Germans have moved forward by the 26th of February, and this line is held quite well until the end of May. But what we see are the Germans really trying to move forward again, but Nivelle is also using his French troops to launch counter-attacks. Now, counter-attacks are just as casualty intensive as an offensive. So what we're seeing at the Battle of Verdun are massive German casualties as they attempt to push forward against the French, but we are also seeing massive French casualties in the opposite direction. And we've got to understand that the French soldiers came to resent the way that they were being used in a way that they felt was a waste of the French soldiers' lives. While they were happy to be there to defend Verdun, they felt that Nivelle's tactics were actually a waste of resources. And this is going to have, contribute to this moral impact of the Battle of Verdun and the way that the French soldiers feel as the war continues. The war continued, and the Germans were able to move forward, take more forts, like Fort Vaux here. But one of the things we've got to understand is it's about this time that another battle opens up. So here's Verdun down here, but another battle opens up in June, July 1916. And this is the Battle of the Somme in this area, which is primarily undertaken by the British, supported by the French. Now, this battle had been planned well in advance, and Verdun by the British and the French, and Verdun had taken them by surprise. And there's a lot of pressure on the British to continue to make sure that the Battle of the Somme happens in order to take pressure off Verdun, because if there is an attacking up here on this part of the line, Germans will have to move some of their troops from Verdun to reinforce the line here. So the Battle of the Somme, while pre-planned, was certainly part of the goal of the Battle of the Somme, was to act as a diversion from Verdun and relieve some of the pressure off the French, who were struggling to hold Verdun in June 1916. This does help, and certainly we do see an easing of the Battle of Verdun after July 1916. And in fact, in August 1916, Falkenhayn, who has failed effectively at Verdun, is forced to resign. And we see a shift in the German commanders at this point. And we're going to come back and learn more later about Hindenburg and Ludendorff. It's Hindenburg here and Ludendorff here, who come as a pair. They work together. Hindenburg is kind of the official head of the army, but Ludendorff is the brains. And really, they work as a very close pair to undertake the German war effort from this point onwards, from August 1916. We're going to talk a lot more about their plans, their strategies, but it's important to understand that when they came to be in charge, the Battle of Verdun doesn't stop straight away, but the intensity of the German offensive does ease up. And therefore, at the Battle of Verdun, really between August and November 1916, there is some fighting, but it is not as intense as it was at the very beginning. And so what we see really is an ending to the Battle of Verdun in November 1916. It is the longest battle on the Western Front, so it takes the honours in terms of being the longest running battle. Most intense, however, between February and May. And if we take a look just back at our notes to finish off, we can see here that whether it was initially intended or not, the Battle of Verdun did have a massive impact on casualties for the French. This was a real war of attrition. It really did wear down the French, not only in morale, but also in terms of physical injuries. Because by the end of the Battle of Verdun, the French had lost 350,000 casualties. We've got to remember, however, that the Battle of Verdun doesn't just have an impact on the French, because it's the Germans who are running the offensive here, and the battle casualties are also very large on the German side. We're seeing here 330,000 casualties on the German side. So what we need to do is start to think about the consequences of the Battle of Verdun, what actually came of it, what comes out of it. And it's not so much about gains in land, because we actually see very little gains, but we need to have a think about the strategies that are being used, and we need to think about what was successful, what was not successful, and we need to have a think about the impact both on the German side and particularly on the French in terms of the physical damage done and the impact on the morale of the armies when you're still continuing to fight a battle of attrition. That's it for the Battle of Verdun.